Dawn crept slowly over Kings Canyon, spilling pale light across the endless stretch of red dust and silent cliffs. The air was still, heavy with the kind of emptiness that makes every sound feel louder than it should. Amid the scrub and stone, rangers stumbled upon something that didn't belong: a small tent, half collapsed, its fabric flapping gently in the wind. At first it looked like another forgotten campsite, swallowed by time and weather. But inside, the story turned dark. Dried blood stained the floor, a faint rust-brown trace of something violent. In one corner, a small suitcase lay open, and within it, a human tongue, carefully wrapped as if meant to be found. The silence seemed to grow thicker, pressing against the walls. Then they saw it scratched deep into the canvas from the inside, the words, "Follow me." Ethan Miller was the kind of man people quietly admired but rarely understood. At 32, he had built a comfortable life as a software developer in Bristol, the sort who spent his days in front of glowing screens, solving complex problems with quiet precision. But outside the world of code, Ethan sought something raw, something untouched. The wilderness called to him in a way city life never could. Friends described him as calm, meticulous, and deeply introspective. He wasn't reckless, not the type to post daring selfies from cliff edges or chase social validation. When Ethan went into the wild, it was for solitude, for peace, and perhaps for answers only silence could give. Kings Canyon in Australia's Northern Territory had always fascinated him. Its raw red cliffs and winding gorges, carved out by ancient rivers, offered both beauty and danger, a place where the modern world felt very far away. In early September 2022, he told his sister Emily that he planned to spend 3 days hiking there alone. He had taken solo trips before, often returning with breathtaking photos and quiet stories of starlit nights and echoing valleys. Emily worried, as sisters do, but Ethan reassured her with his usual calm confidence. "I'll be fine, Em. Just 3 days off the grid," he'd said, half laughing as he packed his gear. He checked his satellite phone, double-checked his maps, and left behind a detailed itinerary, as he always did. On the evening of 16th September, Emily received a brief message from him. It was simple: ordinary, made camp for the night. Incredible view. Talk soon. That was the last anyone ever heard from him. When Monday came and went without Ethan's expected call, Emily tried not to panic. She told herself that perhaps his phone battery had died, or he'd decided to stay another night under the stars. But by Wednesday, dread had begun to take root. She contacted the park rangers, and by Thursday morning, a missing person report was officially filed. The search began immediately. Dozens of rangers, volunteers, and even helicopters combed through the rugged expanse of Kings Canyon. They traced his planned route, checked known campsites, and followed every faint sign they could find. The terrain was unforgiving: steep cliffs, scorching heat by day, and freezing winds by night. Days turned into weeks. They found Ethan's car parked neatly at the trailhead, untouched. His food supplies, checklist, and camping records were all in perfect order. But of Ethan himself, there was nothing. No footprints leading away, no dropped equipment, not even a torn piece of clothing. For Emily, the waiting was unbearable. She flew to Australia, clinging to every possible lead. She spoke to locals, to the park rangers, to anyone who might have seen him. There were rumors, of course: a hiker who claimed to have heard shouting one night, a camper who thought they'd seen a flashlight flicker far off the main trail. But nothing concrete ever emerged. Each clue dissolved under scrutiny, like mirages in the desert heat. By the third week, the official search was scaled back. Rangers admitted privately that the odds of finding Ethan alive were close to none. Emily refused to accept that. She organized private search teams, crowdfunding to hire trackers and drones. But as October faded into November and the desert wind swept over Kings Canyon once more, hope began to die quietly, replaced by the heavy silence of uncertainty. Without a body, without evidence, there could be no closure. The case was eventually classified as cold, a missing hiker presumed dead in one of the harshest terrains on Earth. But those who knew Ethan struggled with that explanation. He was too careful, too experienced to vanish without trace. Something didn't fit. Back in Bristol, Ethan's flat remained untouched. His climbing gear hung neatly on the wall, his coffee mug still sat by the sink. Emily would sometimes visit, sitting in his quiet living room, replaying the last message he'd sent. That single line, "Talk soon," haunted her. She could almost hear his voice, calm and steady, as if he was still out there somewhere, waiting to be found. Months passed. Winter settled in. The case faded from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies. But for Emily, time stood still. Every night she read online forums where hikers and amateur sleuths debated theories: dehydration, a fall, animal attack, or something stranger. A few mentioned the legends of Kings Canyon, whispers of eerie lights and voices in the gorge, stories that locals dismissed as folklore. Yet, as strange as it sounded, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to her brother was more than a tragic accident. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, beneath the sun-bleached rocks and silent shadows, Ethan's trail ended. But the question that lingered, how and why, would soon draw others back to Kings Canyon. What began as a simple hiking trip would unravel into one of the most unsettling disappearances the region had ever seen, setting the stage for a mystery that refused to stay buried. It was early September of the following year, when the silence of Kings Canyon was disturbed once more. The dry air shimmered with heat, the red earth cracked beneath every step, and the wind carried that faint, whispering hum that made the vast emptiness feel alive. Mark and Sarah, a young couple from Adelaide, had set out on a weekend adventure, a simple hike through one of the less-traveled trails of the canyon. They weren't thrill-seekers, just lovers of nature looking for an escape from city life. Yet what they stumbled upon that day would haunt them long after the dust had settled. They were about 3 miles off the Mark trail when Mark noticed something odd, half buried beneath a tangle of dry brush and sand. At first he thought it was just debris, maybe part of an old campsite eroded by the desert winds. But as he brushed away the grit, the dull color of fabric emerged, faded beige, sun-bleached, and brittle. A tent. The tent was small, designed for one person, and looked as though it had been there for months. The poles had collapsed, half swallowed by the earth, and the entrance flap was zipped shut but stiff with dust. Sarah hesitated, glancing around at the endless canyon, stretching in every direction. There was no sign of anyone nearby. No other footprints, no campfire remnants. Only that tent, abandoned and strangely intact in the unforgiving landscape. When they unzipped it, the smell hit them first, not rot, exactly, but the dry, metallic tang of something old and wrong. Inside, time seemed to have stopped. A sleeping bag lay neatly rolled out, its once blue fabric stained dark brown in places where blood had long dried. Next to it sat a small hiking pack, zipped shut. Mark knelt down and unfastened it, hands trembling slightly. Inside, wrapped carefully in what looked like an old handkerchief, was something that froze both of them in place. A human tongue. Dried, leathery, unmistakable. Sarah stumbled backwards, her hand over her. Mouth, eyes wide in disbelief. Mark's instincts told him to step away, to call for help immediately, but his gaze was drawn to the tent wall. Carved into the inner canvas, just above where the sleeping bag lay, were 2 words scratched in uneven letters: "Follow me." The phrase cut deep into the fabric, the edges frayed, as though someone had clawed it out in desperation. They fled the tent, breathless and pale, and scrambled back towards the main trail, where they could finally get a mobile signal. The local ranger station dispatched a patrol immediately, and within an hour, the site was crawling with uniformed officers. Yellow tape went up around the perimeter, cameras clicked, and the desert fell silent again under the weight of official procedure. Detective Louise Hart, who led the initial investigation, described the scene later as the most unsettlingly tidy discovery she'd ever encountered. Nothing appeared random or chaotic. The sleeping bag was perfectly positioned. The pack's contents were organized: a water bottle, a flashlight, a small knife, all neatly arranged as if their owner had planned to return. Even the bloodstains, though unmistakable, looked oddly deliberate, as though wiped or contained. There were no drag marks, no overturned soil, no struggle. It didn't look like the aftermath of violence. It looked like a room someone had prepared and then left behind with purpose. The forensic team moved methodically, collecting every trace they could find. Swabs of the blood confirmed it was human, but the degradation made identification difficult. The tongue, though preserved by the dry climate, offered little immediate insight beyond the fact that it had been severed cleanly. It wasn't chewed, torn, or decomposed. Whoever had done this had tools and time. When the reports reached Emily Miller back in the UK, she felt the world tilt beneath her. The location matched almost exactly the area Ethan had been hiking before. He disappeared. The discovery reignited the media frenzy that had once surrounded his case. Old photos of him resurfaced online, smiling, alive, his eyes calm and confident. Now those same eyes stared from missing person posters beside headlines that whispered of human remains and cryptic messages. Yet the deeper the investigators looked, the stranger it all became. DNA tests later confirmed that the blood inside the tent matched Ethan Miller, but no other remains were ever found. No bones, no tissue, no trace of a body decomposed in the desert heat. And still, the tent, the meticulous order of it, defied every expectation of what a murder or accident scene should look like. Detective Hart would later admit that the "follow me" carving troubled her the most. It didn't feel like the work of a killer taunting police, nor of a victim leaving a cry for help. It felt deliberate, like a message meant for someone specific, someone who would come later. As dusk fell over Kings Canyon that evening, the tent stood alone again, bathed in the amber light of the setting Sunday. The rangers packed up, the police sealed the evidence bags, and silence reclaimed the desert. But there was something unnerving about the air that night, as if the canyon itself was holding its breath. The case that had once gone cold was now alive again, but not in the way anyone had hoped. What had begun as a disappearance had shifted into something far darker, something that blurred the line between the rational and the inexplicable. And for the first time, investigators began to wonder whether Ethan Miller had vanished by accident at all, or whether he had followed something or someone into the canyon that no one could ever trace. The forensic results arrived weeks after the discovery, and they only deepened the enigma. The blood on the tent's floor, the samples from the sleeping bag, even the tissue remnants on the small folding knife found beside the pack, all of it matched Ethan Miller. The same was true of the tongue. The scientists confirmed, without question, that it had been his. That alone should have been a breakthrough, a grim but conclusive end to a year-long disappearance. Yet, somehow, it only made things stranger. The cut on the tongue was surgically precise, a clean separation through the muscle and connective tissue, as if made by a scalpel or a professional-grade blade. The coroner's report specifically noted the absence of jagged edges or hesitation marks, the kind that appear when someone attempts self-harm. This was no frantic act of desperation in the middle of the desert. Whoever severed it had control, skill, and an almost clinical detachment. But then came the most chilling detail. There were no foreign fingerprints, no footprints, no DNA other than Ethan's anywhere in or around the tent. It was as though he had set up the camp, performed the impossible, and vanished into thin air. Investigators returned to Kings Canyon with renewed determination. Search dogs were brought in, sniffing through ravines and dry creek beds. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning for disturbed soil or bones scattered by animals. Every crevice was explored, every possible route he could have taken mapped out with precision. But despite the scale of the effort, they found nothing. The desert gave nothing back, no body, no tracks, no answers. Attention soon turned to the words carved inside the tent. "Follow me." Detectives, journalists, even amateur sleuths online began dissecting its meaning. Was it a message from Ethan himself? A psychological breakdown scribbled in the final hours before his death? Or was it a taunt left by whoever had done this to him? Linguists and behavioral analysts studied the phrasing. The tone was unusual, not pleading, not threatening, almost instructional, as if it were meant as guidance, or perhaps an invitation. With the evidence frozen in contradiction, the investigation began to fracture into theories. The first was the most straightforward and perhaps the most traditional murder by an unknown assailant. According to this idea, Ethan had crossed paths with someone dangerous in the wilderness, perhaps another hiker, a stranger with dark motives, or even a local familiar with the remote trails. But that theory faltered quickly. There was no sign of robbery. His valuables were untouched. His car keys, watch, and wallet were all found inside the pack. No foreign DNA, no footprints, and no reports of suspicious individuals in the area. Whoever did this, if anyone did, had left behind not just a clean crime scene, but an impossible one. The second theory was more unsettling: a ritual killing. A handful of locals, when pressed, spoke of the region's darker legends. There were stories about ancient Aboriginal sites deep within the canyon, where carvings and paintings hinted at spiritual practices long lost to time. Some speculated that Ethan had stumbled upon something sacred, something forbidden, and had become an unwitting participant in a ritual meant to appease whatever forces the desert still held. The tongue, they said, could symbolize silence or the offering of a voice to the unseen. It was the kind of theory that sounded more at home in a late-night documentary than a police report, but even investigators couldn't dismiss it entirely. The eerie neatness of the tent, the deliberate carving of the message, the absence of chaos, it all had the air of something performed rather than improvised. The final theory was, in some ways, the most horrifying self-inflicted psychosis. The notion that Ethan, isolated in the vastness of Kings Canyon, had suffered a sudden mental collapse so severe that he mutilated himself and disappeared. Forensic psychiatrists were consulted. They analyzed his online activity, his emails, his digital footprint. Nothing suggested instability. His work records, medical history, and correspondence with Emily all painted the portrait of a calm, rational man. Yet, in the world of psychological anomalies, nothing is ever fully impossible. Could extreme isolation, dehydration, or exposure have triggered a psychotic break? Could Ethan have imagined something that compelled him to write, "Follow me," a hallucinated voice, an unseen presence in the canyon? Detective Hart never ruled that theory out entirely, but she struggled to reconcile it with the physical evidence. If he did this to himself, she said later, then where did he go? There's no blood trail, no drag marks, no trace of a body. You can't vanish into rock. Months dragged into years, and the file grew thick with speculation, but thin with truth. The tent and its contents were preserved in a controlled facility, occasionally revisited when new forensic methods became available. None yielded anything new. Every lead ran dry. Emily Miller, unwilling to let go, traveled back to the canyon once more, this time with a private documentary crew. She stood where her brother's tent had been, the same ground where Mark and Sarah had made their discovery. The landscape stretched endlessly before her, indifferent and silent. She said later that, in the stillness, she could almost hear him, or rather, something that felt like him whispering through the wind. The official investigation eventually closed again, classified once more as a cold case. No suspects, no weapon, no body. Only a tent, a tongue, and a message that seemed to echo long after the rangers left. Follow me. To this day, hikers who pass through that section of Kings Canyon claim to feel watched, as if the desert itself remembers. Some say they hear faint whispers at night, carried by the wind between the cliffs, words they can't quite make out. Others, who know the story, refuse to go near the place at all, because whether it was murder, madness, or something older and darker, one truth remains. Ethan Miller walked into the wilderness, and the wilderness never let him go. To this day, the disappearance of Ethan Miller remains one of Kings Canyon's most unsettling mysteries. No suspect was ever identified, no motive uncovered, and no body ever found. The single fragment of truth, the severed tongue, stands as both proof and puzzle, a grotesque reminder that something terrible happened, yet nothing can explain how or why. The words, "Follow me," still carved deep into the canvas of that long-seas tent, continue to torment those who've studied the case. Was it a plea for help, a warning, or an invitation into madness? No one knows. Over time, the story has slipped from police archives into whispered legend. Hikers still talk about Ethan's tent, about the feeling that the canyon somehow remembers. They say that when the sun sinks and the air cools, you can hear the wind moving through the rocks like a whisper, carrying echoes of that phrase, soft, deliberate, almost human. Perhaps it's nothing more than the desert playing tricks. Or perhaps some stories never truly end. They simply wait for someone else to follow. And maybe that's what makes this case linger, not the gore or the unanswered evidence, but the quiet horror of not knowing. Because in a world obsessed with explanations, Ethan's story reminds us that some truths stay buried and some paths, once taken, can never be retraced. If you'd like to keep exploring real-life mysteries like this one, the stories that unsettle,